The Atari 2600, are you a fan of it? Are you a fan of the games? Did you grow up with it? I know I did, and that's why I want to talk about it in this video, because most of the time when I hear people talk about retro games, when they want to talk about retro games, they refer to something like the Nintendo 64, which is great. You know, you grew up with that, fantastic. That was the system you played as a kid. But I'm going to go way back. We're going to take you way back. I am super OG, and the very first video game system that I ever played was actually the grandfather of all home video game systems, and the one that kicked it off the most, the Atari 2600. Now, I know there are other gaming channels out there, like the gaming historian channels, who want to talk about the systems with all the factual information. They're almost professional documentaries, and that's great. I love them. I love what they're doing. Fantastic. They do great work. But what they can't give you that I can give you are the personal stories. Like I said, I grew up with the system way back in the day, and I can tell you some pretty interesting situations that me and my friends got into with the system. Now, there were two versions of the 2600. The very first one had the wood grain. We got the classic look to it. And then what they did was they streamlined it a little bit later on and made it a little bit more sleek, a little bit more black, kind of doing what PlayStation kind of done in a way, just making slicker, slimmer versions of it, right? But that was actually one of the downfalls of the 2600, is that they didn't make a full new system of it until it was too late. They kept going on with the original system because it was making a butt ton of money at the time, and that contributed to its downfall. They never came out with a more powerful system. They kept lingering on with the 2600, but we'll get into that. One thing I want to tell you right away is that, why is the top of the original system flat? I guess some people can say, well, it's used to rest your, the controllers on top of it so that they don't, I don't know, they're just out of the way. It's just part of the design that was weird to me, but we never actually used it for that. You know what we did use it for? A coaster. Yes, we put our drinks on it, our Coca-Colas, our Pepsis, and our big Slurpees we would get from 7-Eleven that would come into those cool plastic collector's cups. Sometimes they would have monsters on them. Sometimes I think they would have superheroes on them. Whatever, 7-Eleven just wanted you to buy the cups to collect them. But I tell you, yeah, many a Slurpee had spilt on top of our Atari 2600. Next, I want to talk about the controller, or the joystick. Yes, that is exactly what it's called. It had one button on it, and it had like the stiffest stick that you ever felt in your hands. Fun fact, no one ever referred to their penis as a joystick before the 2600 came out. Yes, Atari coined the phrase. But anyway, it was stiff, it was awkward, you had to plug it into the back of the system, which made no sense. But a little personal story that I like to say with it is that a lot of them, including my own and my friends as well, always the top of the joystick, because it was kind of like gooey rubbery, it was soft rubber, they always had chew marks in them. I don't know why, but it's maybe like the same thing when you put a pencil, the back of a pencil with an eraser in your mouth and kind of chew on it when you're thinking. We just put the controllers in our mouths and kind of gnawed on them like a chew toy sometimes. I don't know why, but it's just a thing with the controller. And you had no real choice. You had to use the real stiff, awkward controller at that time, until later on when third parties started coming out with better joysticks for it. And right away I bought one because they would wear out after a while. They were notorious for just not working after a bit. And I bought an Archer. It was called an Archer controller, and I'm going to show it right here. And it's really cool because the actual joystick on it was smaller, it was slimmer, and it felt more like the analog sticks of today. It was a lot easier to move around, and holy cow, did it improve the gameplay 1000%. It also had a way longer cord on it as well. I mean, I can't believe how well, I couldn't wear it out either. That controller, it didn't even cost very much money, and it completely outlasted and outperformed the original Atari controller 1,000 times. Now, when you hooked up the system, you actually had to get your parents to help you, and I think the commercials even said something like that back in the day. They were always like, get your parents to help you set it up, you know, and we did, because we didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about video games, and of course I didn't know how to hook it up to my TV, because you had these, I remember this weird box on the back of it, okay? And I don't even know what it's called, I don't even care, but I'm just gonna show you the picture of it. And it had a couple of like bunny ears on it or something, and you could connect it to, you had to actually have tools. You needed a screwdriver and you had to connect it to this sort of cable outlet. But if your TV didn't have that, which ours didn't, it was ancient, you actually had to hook those you had to screw those bunny ears right into the back of the TV. And I remember when, back in the day when I learned how to hook it up myself, you would actually get you would get an electrical shock from that thing sometimes as a kid. That was funny. It would give you a little bit of a buzz, but hey, it was well worth the pain in order to be able to play the video games. Now, everyone goes on and on like I have about the joystick, but what I don't notice is a lot of people ignore the secondary controllers that came with it. Now, when I got my Atari 2600 as a kid, I didn't get it brand new. I think it was either my parents got it from a friend of theirs and it was just given to them or something like that. They didn't play it anymore. And you gotta remember, the video games in general at this time were a new invention. I mean, we didn't even have tape decks. I mean, we had to play our music on these circular vinyl things called records at the time. This was a long time ago. I mean, hell, even the saber-toothed tiger and woolly mammoth in the Northwest Territories weren't even extinct yet. That's how long ago this was. And so it just came in a great big box, okay? It was all wires all tangled up. It kind of looked like Christmas decorations. All the games and everything, it was just all piled together. And my parents, it wasn't mine, they didn't actually give it to me, it was theirs, because you gotta remember, video games were new, and they thought it was just a really cool piece of tech that you could actually play on, you know, you had interactive TV essentially now. So video games more were an adult thing, more than an actual kid thing. So whenever they stopped playing, they would let me play it. And so we'd take it all out of the box, and then there was always the tangled up controller, like I said before, that not very many people talk about, and that is the Atari 2600 paddles. Now, they don't exactly look like paddles, they're just a circular disc on a controller that you spin, and it has a button on it, and it actually says paddles on them. But what's interesting about those is that there were two of them, but they were connected to one cord. There were two on each cord, so you had four. So technically, the Atari 2600 was one of the very first systems that I remember ever playing that was 4 players at the same time. That was pretty damn cool. And like I said, you plugged it in the back, and there was only 2 controller ports on the back of the system, but the paddles, the wires would splice off into 2 paddles with one connector on the end. And it was great because back then we didn't have there was no co-op games. Every single Atari game that I could think of at that time was always a versus game, like Combat or Outlaw. And so one of the best versus games that was 4 players at the same time, and I think they did a remake of it, was Warlords. And to explain the game in a nutshell, which isn't hard because Atari games are very simplistic, is you have a flag in the center, or I always thought of it as a kid as a king, and these were his robes. I mean, it looks like it, doesn't it? Makes sense. And you have a castle that are your walls around your king, and there's a cannonball that bounces around the screen, and you have a big shield that you control that's in front of your castle wall, and you have to ricochet the cannonball, kind of like Breakout, into your opponent's castle walls, destroy the walls, get the cannonball inside and destroy his king, and then you wipe him out of the game, and then it goes on from there until there's only one winner. But it's a very cool game. It's 4 players at the same time. I remember playing a lot of it, and I think it said something on the front of the box that there was like 23 games inside. What they really mean is there's like 23 modes of play inside. And let me tell you, that's really stretching it. Now, I just want to mention a couple of the best games that I ever played as a kid for the system. And the very first one has got to be Moon Patrol. Now, Moon Patrol is based off of an arcade game of the exact same name. So, but I mean, the graphics on it were really good for Atari. It actually had music. Most Atari games did not have a musical soundtrack at the time. And it had multiple levels. Again, another thing most Atari games did not have. And what you did was you controlled this sort of lunar rover, and you could shoot a laser beam forward or a laser beam up at the same time. And you had these UFOs that would come above you trying to kill you. You had to jump across different types of obstacles in your way, pits and rocks. And actually, come to think of it, it's one of the very first endless runner type app games that was ever invented, because it's an endless runner game. Look at it, look how it plays exactly the same. So I found that interesting. The next game that I absolutely adored as a kid, and it really is one of the top games for the system, is Yars Revenge, without a doubt. Look at the box artwork here. It's incredible. Look, you just don't see this stuff anymore. And you get to control this huge mechanical type wasp-like creature that would shoot these beams out of his mouth, or these electric balls like it shows in the picture, and you had to dodge that huge menacing looking missile that comes after you. Except that when you actually played the game, it didn't really look like that. The missile was actually just a couple of pixels, square pixels that came after you. But back then, you really had to use your imagination. And I think that the box artwork really shows that a lot. It's not just to sell the game, it's to articulate more about what the pixels are trying to represent. So the box artwork was very important to the actual game, and Yars Revenge is perfect for that, even though it's an actually really good Atari game. Like I said, you have to destroy the walls to get to the actual missile launcher on the inside and destroy it. And you've got these force fields, you got all sorts of different things in this game that you can do, where most of the other games at the time for Atari were much more simplistic. And then the last game, probably the game that I played the most, especially nearing the end of the Atari 2600's lifespan, was Vanguard. No one ever talks about this game for 2600. This has got to be like the most advanced game, other than like maybe a couple of others, but this is way up there. Okay, Vanguard, you control this spaceship, and the spaceship can shoot in all four directions, up, down, left, and right, depending on which way you move the controller. You didn't even have to push the button down. It had the fire button was just always shooting all the time, so that you didn't get thumb cramp. You know, that was really, they put a lot of forethought into that ahead of time. And you're attacked by all these different enemies all the time. Even some of them look like the Yars Revenge actual electronic wasps on some of the stages. And there are alien eggs that attack you. There are these weird snake aliens that come after you, missiles. There's all sorts of enemies. There's multiple stages. The stages are all sort of different. Sometimes you scroll vertical, sometimes you scroll horizontal. There are these energy cubes that you can grab that make you indestructible for a limited amount of time. And there's an actual boss at the end. No other Atari game had a boss. Okay, it's not much of a boss. You just shoot him one time and he's dead, but it's a boss nonetheless. So that's it. What do you think about the Atari 2600? I know there's a 50-year anniversary collection that seems pretty damn good, and I don't expect a lot of people to relate to me who actually played it back in the day, but if you did, that's pretty awesome. And if you played it today, you are playing basically the very beginning of the invention of the video game, because like I said, Atari was the granddaddy of them all. They started it all. It was the first mainstream system with different games and cartridges you could take in and out of it that blew up and went all over the place, and so many people had them. It took the entire video game, nation, community by storm, until it actually contributed to the crash of the video game system itself. So that's another story for another time. So thank you very much for joining me. If you did enjoy the video, hit the like button. And if you want to see content like this again, hit the subscribe button. I promise you it will be worthwhile for you to come back. And I'll see you next time.